Welcome to the 2023 Fleeceling Quilt Along. I'm Laura Struck from Made Peachy, and over this series of videos we're going to work towards creating a sampler quilt. This 9-block sampler quilt features a selection of products from the Fleeceling quilting range, and each video will walk you through the process of start to finish to create each unique quilting block. Block number 6 in the sampler quilt is a Flying Geese motif, and this has been created using the Fleeceling QuickScreen Square. Block number 6 in the sampler quilt is a Flying Geese motif, and we're going to be using Fleeceling QuickScreen Square. So the fabrics we need a background fabric and some fabrics that will form the geese motif. So I'm choosing a neutral colour for the background and a selection of bolder colours to make the geese. I'm also going to need a rotary cutter, ruler and cutting mat. The Flying Geese block features 4 geese motifs that will work around the block itself. So we need to cut 4 squares from the geese fabric and 8 squares from the background fabric. The squares need to measure between 3.5 and 4 inches square. Once the squares are cut, they need to be trimmed into triangles. So to do this, we're just going to use the cutting mat with our ruler and our rotary cutter, and carefully position the ruler so it cuts straight through the diagonal line of our square, and we're going to trim it, and that's going to make the motif for our geese. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut all of the geese motifs in this manner, and the same with the background fabrics. The Flying Geese motif is worked on a piece of Fleeceling QuickScreen Square. So I've trimmed this down to 22 squares by 22 squares, and that's going to be the size of our overall block plus seam allowance. Once we've done that, we need to quarter the block to make the foundation for the 4 geese. So I've trimmed down to make 4 small blocks that measure 11 by 11 squares. With the QuickScreen Square cut into 4 pieces, that's a piece for each of the geese motifs, what we're going to do is mark out the grid in which we're going to place our fabrics. So with a pen and ruler, I've begun by drawing a border around the block, and that's positioned 1 square in the whole way round. I've marked the centre line, and here it falls in the middle of the centre block. So I have just drawn a straight line all the way down. I've created a triangle using those guides, and this triangle is 5 squares high and the top triangle is 4 squares high. And what we're going to do is we are going to be using this to place our fabric. So this is the section that we're going to place the geese fabrics, and here we're going to be placing the background fabrics. Each of the 4 Flying Geese motifs are going to be using the marked up section of QuickScreen Square, 2 of the geese fabrics which are placed in the centre, and the 4 background fabrics which are placed at the 4 corners. For the construction, we're going to be working on the unprinted side of the QuickScreen Square. So to do this, we're going to take the first geese motif and place that into the centre there to cover that lower triangle. The background fabrics need to be placed on both of the sides, and we're going to work each side in turn. So I'll start here and I'll take my background fabric, and placing right sides to right side, I'm going to pin in place and secure that ready for stitching. To stitch this section in place, I'm going to be taking it to the sewing machine and working on the reverse, so on the grid side, and I'm going to be using the lines that I've marked here. I'm going to be working from the top all the way down to secure that first portion of the Flying Geese motif. Here at the sewing machine, I've got my geese motif ready to stitch the first element. So I've got the grid side facing uppermost, and I'm using this drawn on line as my stitching guide. I've made sure that the pin is completely out of the way of the stitching line so that we don't have any problems with it coming into contact with the needle. I'm using a size 80 needle here with a 50 weight thread so that my stitches won't bulk up the seams. I'm just going to drop my needle down, and I'm going to work carefully along this stitching line. I'm using a 2mm size stitch here and just stitching all the way to the end to secure that first element. So we've stitched on the first element of the geese here, so the background fabric, and we've followed the stitching line all the way down. What we need to do is to just fold this fabric back on itself. We can press or finger press that just in place to hold it nice and neatly. And then we're ready to position the second fabric. So the second fabric to be added is going to be placed here. So again, it's the same principle, right side's facing down. We're going to secure in place with a pin and return to the sewing machine to stitch all the way along to secure the second element. With this second element of background stitched in place, we can now see that the motif is beginning to emerge. Before we move on and add in the next section, so the upper portion of our design, we need to remove some of this excess here. So where we've cut our squares slightly larger to accommodate a little bit of wiggle room on our seams, we're going to actually get quite a lot of bulk there where our next part of our motif is set to go. So just to neaten that up, we can place it onto a cutting mat and fold back the QuickScreen Square. Now I'm folding it back onto itself, allowing me access to this excess here. I don't need to trim it back a huge amount. I don't need to cut back towards the stitches, but I can take a small section off using a rotary cutter, and that's going to neaten up the area where I'm going to apply the next element of the motif. So here we have our block in place, and I can position on my next section, which is the upper geese motif, pin in place, ready to stitch. So we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to be following our marked line on the grid here all the way across to secure in that next section. Over at the machine, we've got the grid side facing uppermost, and I'm going to bring the needle down so that it sits directly on the marked line, and just working across that line nice and evenly to secure the next element into position. Here we've stitched all the way across and secured that upper part of the design. So we've followed the grid line here. And now we're doing the stitch and flip technique again. So we've stitched it and we're going to flip the fabric open. And we can finger press or press with an iron just to reveal that upper section. To complete the block, we need to add on the two background fabrics which are placed here and here. We're going to work each side in turn. So position, pin and stitch. And we're going to repeat that process for this element and press open, and then the final element and press open. With the final background element stitched in, the motif is complete. We just need to tidy it up and square up our block. Because we've been working with the QuickScreen Square, we've got the benefit that the grid is already square. We've used the grid lines to cut that. So wrong side up, so the grid side uppermost, I'm going to use my ruler and rotary cutter, and using the grid lines as a guide, I'm simply going to trim everything down. All of the excess fabric that overhangs is just going to be trimmed away, and it's going to reveal a lovely neat block. So everything is all trimmed away, and we have our completed motif. With all of the blocks squared up, we can simply press the fabrics one last time to neaten them up, and then go ahead and make 4 more in exactly the same method by pinning the fabrics onto the unprinted side, flipping and stitching on the grid side. Once we've created 4 of the Flying Geese motifs, we can then decide on the placement for the block. So I'm going to just move these around and see the position I like best. So I'm looking at the colour placement and also the orientation of the geese. So we've got a smaller motif at the top and a larger one at the bottom. So I'm going to just take a look at how they look in different orientations. And once I'm happy with the layout, once I'm happy with the placement of each of the blocks, I can then join them together to finish the entire block. So I'll do that by placing each of them right sides to right sides, and then using pins or clips just secure them along this side that's got to be joined. So we're going to take these over to the sewing machine, and again we're going to use a straight stitch following the guidelines to seam the 2 elements for the top and the bottom of the block. With the seams worked to join the upper and the lower section, we can then open them out and look at how the block is coming together. So what we've got here is our seam allowance, and we need to make sure that we're not creating a section of bulk where they may meet at the centre. To do that, I'm going to press the seam allowance on this upper section towards the right hand side and the lower section towards the left hand side. So just carefully pressing the fabrics and making sure that I'm pushing the seam allowance on one element to the left and on the other element to the right. Once it's been pressed, I can then place the two elements, the top and the bottom, right sides together, and I'm able to create a nest with my seam allowances. So I have one of the sets of seam allowance moving towards the left hand side and the other to the right hand side, so I can carefully nest those and pin in place. Again, we're going to be stitching the whole way along this grid line, so just pinning or clipping these elements ready to stitch. With the central seam work to join the upper and lower portions, we can open out our work and reveal the completed block. We're just going to take time to just work over the block with the iron and just press it nice and flat. The Flying Geese block is now ready to be quilted. Be sure to check out the other videos in the series to create all 9 blocks of your sampler quilt. You can find our Quilt as you go method video in the series also, and this will show you how to piece together your finished sampler quilt. Thank you so much for joining me for the Vliseline 2023 Quilt Along. You can find out more about the Vliseline products on the Vliseline website at vliseline.com, and you can follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Vliseline UK. You can find me online at madepeachy.com. Please do share your projects online and tag us in your makes. We do love to see them.